Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for Fugitive Planning and Potentials for Study, Lessons from the Japanese Studies and Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project. I'm Professor Reginald Jackson, and I'm joined here today by two of my collaborators.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sophie Hasuo.
And I'm Rachel Willis.
And today we're going to present together. We're going to do a kind of group presentation. I'm going to kick things off, and then Sophie will follow, and then Rachel will follow her. And I'd like to just kind of give you a sense of the flow of things. After we have each presented individually, we'll have a bit of a conversation amongst ourselves about some of the lessons learned through the JSAP project. And then that will then be a seg into the Q&A portion with the audience. Please be aware that you can add questions to the chat via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to do that throughout the presentations, and we'll try to get through as many of those at the end as we can. So, as I said, my name is Reggie Jackson, and I'm Associate Professor of Pre-Modern Japanese Literature and Performance in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And I am, I guess, what would be called the principal investigator of the JSAP, or Japanese Studies and Anti-Racist Pedagogy project. And I'd like to, first of all, just thank all of you for being here. Since this is the last webinar that we'll be doing of the season, it seems especially important to thank all of the people and organizations who've supported our work. So let me just go ahead and share my screen here. By expressing some gratitude. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Sophie Hasuo, Rachel Willis, and Harrison Watson, who's unable to join us today, for all of their efforts over the past year. So very little of what we've been able to put into this world would have been feasible without all of their invaluable help. Similarly, I'd like to thank Professor Huaji Shin, our Toyota visiting professor, who signed on early in the stages of proposing this to the Center for Japanese Studies as a co-conspirator for the purposes of securing that funding. So thank you so much, Huaji. I'd also like to thank all of our collaborators, the people who've been presenting all of their incredibly brilliant and useful webinars over the course of the semester, and also sharing with us their stories in the podcasts. This includes Tak Fujitani, Jayanthi Selinger, Leo Ching, Zelida Thrivas, Anne-Maria Shimabuku, Andrea Mendoza, and most recently, Mika Kennedy. All of these folks were inspiring in multiple ways and certainly helped and certainly helped me to, helped me to think more about some of the underlying theories of this project, to think about community in more generative ways, and to think about not just the world of Japanese studies as a field, but then also the worlds beyond it. I especially appreciate their willingness to share not just their research and teaching, but also their stories, which were fascinating, moving, and overflowing with generosity and insight. I'd also like to thank the Center for Japanese Studies for funding this initiative, along with Robin Griffin, Justin Schell, Yuri Fukazawa, Dohi Morsman, Imara Dawson, Jake Crawford, and Peggy Redberg for all of their logistical support with podcasts, social media, advertising, payments, etc. Needless to say, this is a collaborative project, and I'll return to that theme throughout the course of this presentation. So in terms of the overall flow here, I'd like to give you an outline of what we'll be doing today. First thing I want to do is to historicize the project, both in terms of institutional location and our contemporary moment. Then I'd like to provide an account of some of the conceptual and political ideas that help to kind of frame the project and then outline the kind of intervention that the project attempts to make. And then third, I'd like to consider in some specific detail different elements of the course that we taught, Antiracism and Japanese Culture, and Sophie and Rachel will help us quite a bit with that. Try to think about some of the lessons learned from that teaching experience, along with other things like the podcast interviews, reviewing applications for the graduate syllabus workshop, which is tomorrow, and then rethinking the goals and potential extensions of this project. So with that said, I'd like to do some historical considerations, or what I'd like to call generative failure and the question of timeliness. So I think it's important to say right off the bat that failure is important. I think about failing often, failing hopefully with some sincerity, but failing forward as well. And I think it's important to say that this project is born out of several overlapping failures. Failures to secure funding, failures to fit neatly into certain categories, failure to align squarely with ideals of legibility and excellence that tend to reproduce aspects of the academy we see as being problematic, counterproductive, or suffocating. But I'd like all of us to notice that some failures are accidental and some are actually the product of deliberate action on our part. So to give just one example, we applied for the Mellon Just Futures grant in the fall, had a very quick turnaround, but we hustled and had lots of help from folks to kind of get that grant in to the tune of around, I think, $4.2 million, give or take. And although we weren't successful in being funded, that proposal process still helped with preparation for the course that we taught, Asian 480, WGS, I think 435, and for refining our JSAP proposal to the Center for Japanese Studies. So I just want to say that even though we weren't able to secure millions of dollars in funding, the process of failing and trying to rethink what might be possible at a much, much smaller scale, I think was really useful. So, along those lines, I want to just say that around the question of timeliness, that I've been heartened by the outpouring of support for some of our JSAP work recently. And in that context, several people have commended us for doing such a timely project, presumably because what we're doing seems to intersect with the broader calls for racial justice within the world, within the US, and within the academy. I take this as a compliment, but a bittersweet one. And I say it's bittersweet because I think it's really important to note that I first proposed this project actually 3 years ago, in 2018. And while I can't go into all of the details, suffice it to say that I wrote a proposal for doing the Origin Stories podcast and then some K through 12 lesson modules, mainly as a way of addressing a lack of diversity in the field of Japanese studies. My field is pre-modern Japanese studies, which I think is even less diverse in many ways, certainly in terms of race. And at the time, I was really thinking about trying to build some kind of multiracial, transnational, multi-institutional network of scholars at various levels, mainly to remake the field as I'd known it. This goal was both ambitious and naive. It was also summarily dismissed by university administrators at the time. I should say that, to be honest, I felt pretty devalued, if not even dehumanized, in the process of this encounter with bureaucracy. And it was clear that in the heady pre-COVID, pre-Breonna Taylor, pre-George Floyd, pre-Atlanta spa shooting days, the university had little inclination towards acknowledging a need to intervene in this way or to fund such an intervention. As we learn more about gifts from folks like Ron Weiser and court-mandated settlement payments estimated to reach potentially $500 million to redress decades of sexual abuse on the university's watch, thinking carefully about when, how, and why the university, and this university in particular, chooses to validate and value certain DEI initiatives under the banner of pursuing excellence should become an analytical, if not a political, priority. Bill Reddings explains that excellence draws only one boundary, and that's the boundary that protects the unrestricted power of the bureaucracy. He also says, quote, "Excellence is thus the integrating principle that allows diversity, the other watchword of the university prospectus, to be tolerated without threatening the unity of the system." And this is from his book, The University in Ruins, which is a really key text for me in thinking about the relationship between initiatives like this and how words like excellence, which ostensibly we should all be in favor of, could actually have detrimental effects on our learning, to not say nothing of our being. So I want you to kind of think about this notion of excellence and the ways that you all might invest in it in different ways. I certainly have been invested in it, what it means to be rigorous, what it means to strive. But I also want to say that along these lines, then, I've had some reservations about thinking about how something that seems that wants to be devoted to anti-racist study and is kind of aligns with DEI initiatives that the university is already undertaking might be co-opted or might be undercut or might be swallowed up by a rhetoric of diversity that might actually be counter to some of the things that we're trying to build through JSAP. And on this point, I'm reminded of a gesture on August 6th of 2020, after evicting students here at U of M and raising tuition, of our university invoking the example of John Lewis and offering copies of Brian Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption in preparation for a larger conversation about racial justice. As a critique of this gesture, a U of M community member named Jeff Lockhart wrote the following. Dear Dean Curzan, I strongly encourage you to add Matthew Johnson's Undermining Racial Justice 2020 to these plans. Johnson uses extensive research in U of M's own archives to examine how provosts, presidents, and deans of our university, past and present, have been complicit in, well, undermining racial justice on our campus. No evidence-based intervention on racial injustice in the U of M community would be complete if it omitted such extensive, locally relevant research. Best, Jeff. This is an email from August 8th, 2020. So I mentioned this to say a couple of things. I mean, one is that underlying this JSAP project is a larger concern about resources, how resources are apportioned, what types of things can be resourced from the university, and all the ways in which a lot of this work has to take place outside of the university, beyond university bureaucratic structures, beyond university notions of excellence or progress, to say nothing of surveillance and accounting, as opposed to accountability, say. And so these are some of the things that were on my mind when thinking about how to kind of retool and propose something that might become then the JSAP project. I think it's important to note too that in this kind of system, which say the university system, actual care for students, staff, faculty tends to be abandoned in favor of profit accumulation and cost-saving measures. I think we saw this in terms of kind of the events of the past year, not just the tuition raise, but then also what it means to have to pay more for safety on the one hand, but one question is how safe are we really? And so along these lines, I think that the cost has been on my mind. And maybe one lesson to take away from this is that sometimes we have to learn to work cheaply and retool towards practices that don't necessitate bureaucratic oversight and the devaluation that comes from that oversight. And the pun on oversight is obviously deliberate. So what would it mean to do this kind of work, this labor that tends to be shadow labor, uncompensated labor, labor that falls disproportionately to women and faculty of color, that isn't readily incorporable into the university's logic of valuation? And I think that that's something that we've thought a lot about over the course of developing our initiatives. I think that for me, it involves a kind of double consciousness with regard to some of these things. To say nothing of an emotional burden of trying to build something valuable despite the institution's calculated devaluation of some of this work. And that's not everywhere. And I really do want to say, I really want to thank Rob Sellers in particular for being such an ally and co-conspirator in the best of ways for me personally, but also, and I think in a sincere way, trying to really to intervene in lots of different ways at the provostial level to improve the culture of the university. So I don't want to say that I take those for granted, but he's just one person and there's lots of people doing this work, but there are lots of other patterns that tend to also undercut that work. So along these lines, I just want to say it can be really demoralizing to feel gaslit and what it means to have to try to repurpose or siphon resources, spiritual, intellectual, financial resources from various places. But in the end, I think it's a good thing, not because it's fun, but because it means that one is confronted with the harsh truth, the reality that no one can save us but ourselves. And so I think one of these things to keep in mind is that, or another lesson would be that we should regard the institutional rhetoric of care for marginalized folks with extreme suspicion and persist in spite of the noise. So one question we might ask then along these lines is, why did it take an explosion of white supremacist violence to produce a response, to produce different modes of new avenues for funding, these kinds of things that might stem the tide? And then also, what types of work might occur below the radar of institutional surveillance, and how might we indulge that kind of work communally. So already it should be clear that this type of work is necessarily collaborative. And I should say that it's right off the bat that it's become a venue for producing communities of study that are adjacent to but irreducible to the university. And so what I want to say, and put more bluntly, is one of the main lessons I'd like to leave us with, which is that there is really, I think, no way for the most ambitious or radical anti-racist work to succeed within the university. This might seem like a bummer. It might seem pessimistic or just inaccurate. But what I have in mind here, and some of you have heard me talk about this before, is just trying to think a little bit about historical legacies within the University of Michigan in particular. This is the Michigan Theater. Some of you have seen these images before. This is before the pandemic, obviously, for one of our CJS film series. But once upon a time, here at our very university, the marquee read differently. And this was during the Army's intensive Japanese language school, and credit goes to, for Japanese studies, particularly Bradley Hammond, another colleague and co-conspirator and friend, who put together some of these resources for the 70th anniversary of the Center for Japanese Studies. And this was, another way of expressing community, supremacist, deeply racist and xenophobic, but also a way for students to come together and celebrate through music and dance and their love of Japanese culture, or something, or at least the Japanese language, as a strategic, something of strategic value. I think it's really important to keep these kinds of archival resources. Rachel will talk more about this, and Sophie too, but what it means to dig into the archives, to think, not just to find things that disappoint us or remind us of how racist the world can be, but rather to kind of use those as resources to then rethink things, to retool, and to teach in different ways. So I think that here, what I have in mind then are thinking about the archive as a resource, as a way to energize some of the thinking that goes around the class, Antiracism and Japanese Culture, but then also the JSAP project, and as a way to clear the ground, to have hope, actually, not in a starry-eyed, naive way, but hope in the manner that Black feminist thinkers and activists like Mariame Kaba mean when they say that hope is a discipline. And I want to just read one thing that she says about hope here. She says, I always tell people, for me, hope doesn't preclude feeling sadness or frustration or anger or any other emotion that makes total sense. Hope isn't an emotion, you know. Hope is not optimism. I think that for me, understanding that is really helpful in my practice around organizing, which is that I believe that there's always a potential for transformation and for change, and that in any direction, good or bad. The idea of hope being a discipline is something I heard from a nun many years ago, who was talking about it in conjunction with making sure we were of the world and in the world. Living in the afterlife already in the present was kind of a form of escape, but actually that was really, really important for us to live in the world and to be of the world. The hope she was talking about was this grounded hope that was practiced every day, that people actually practiced it all the time. And so I bowed down to that. I heard that many years ago, and I felt the sense of, oh my God, that speaks to me as a philosophy of living, that hope is a discipline and that we have to practice it every single day. So I find that really, and her work generally, and I thank Phil Caffin for hipping me to Mariame Kaba's work, in abolition, particularly prison industrial complex abolition. But I want to just kind of underscore that the initial premise is helpful and hopeful because it prevents the gaslighting endemic to the neoliberal university with entrenched corporate multiculturalism, its structures of neglect, and the performative expressions of concern over white supremacist violence. So I think one of the things I want to say about JSAP is that for me personally, a project like this, it has to remain fugitive from the university in order to remain sane, to remain viable, hopefully generative, and joyful, lest the university distract us or deaden that energy or devour movements toward liberation. So one lesson there is that evading the university's most disciplining practices helps us practice the discipline of hope. So along these lines, I think that I want to kind of move from thinking about teaching Japanese things or Japanese culture from something like what might have happened during World War II and since, and the legacies of that, to building a kind of community like that of things like the UAB or Undergraduate Advisory Board, which is to say much more diverse in lots of different ways in terms of national origin and gender and sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, et cetera, class, income, and try to kind of what would it mean to make the field of Japanese studies, but also these communities of study look more like this. And that's something that involves not just hoping, but actually a lot of doing as well. So in terms of intellectual kind of background, I mean, I want to kind of point out that there are lots of books that were really central for thinking about this project. One is Bill Redding's The University in Ruins, which I quoted from before. Another major one is Harney and Moten's The Undercommons, which has had an incredibly strong impact on me, and some folks that were participated in an early version of the Asian Languages and Cultures DEI reading group. And I think folks like Yusong Hao and Swarnam Kare were participating in that, Raya Namne. You know, this has really been important, particularly in terms of thinking about fugitivity and what it means to think beyond or outside of the university while being in some ways trapped within it. But then also thinking about kind of ways to exceed those expectations. Another major text has been Sarah Ahmed's on Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life, particularly her sense of the brick wall and what diversity work costs, I think has been really useful. LePaperson's A Third University is Possible, particularly in terms of thinking about how decolonizing the university might work. And most recently, and I highly recommend this book for folks that don't know it, We Do This Till We Free Us by Mariam Kaba, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. So all of these books, all of which I would recommend for different reasons, I think are useful for anyone who's trying to think not just about anti-racism in an academic context, but just in terms of trying to transform the world. So with this in mind, one question I have then is, you know, how should then we think about Japanese studies as being implicated within this broader moment of upheaval? And along these lines, you know, I want to say that Black feminist scholarship really, I want to propose that that kind of scholarship becomes a requirement for analyzing Japanese culture. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the details of the class. And what I want to suggest is that maybe Japanese studies misses a lot of opportunities because the scholarship is left out of the conversation. It's thought to be too far afield or irrelevant. And maybe because we keep quoting the wrong people and are ignorant of the generative possibilities that are opened by recourse to BIPOC scholars and unfamiliar archives. So that's another thing that then the JSAP project is trying to address. Along these lines, then, you know, I want to say a couple things before turning it over to Sophie to talk more about the class specifically. So one of the things that we're trying to do, I think at base, is to reimagine what community might look like, to think about how our work might respond to this broader context. And in this context, I just want to just name some of the things that I've been thinking about. So things like the killing of George Floyd, things like folks like Jared Kushner, and the admissions kind of affirmative action kerfuffle at Harvard, and thinking about, for instance, how in many ways Black and other students of color who are not Asian, non-Asian students of color were being scapegoated in that context. And I was really fascinated, for instance, by the push to somehow be less racist in admitting more Asian students on the one hand, but without really kind of thinking seriously about things like legacy admissions. That's one of the things to consider. Things like, as well, the strike in the fall, a geo strike. I tend to be very much in favor of those, but I was also kind of struck by, in some ways, how cynical the 50% reduction proposal was in terms of defunding the police, which seemed not to really take into account or really value kind of conversation with people already doing lots of work on that issue and really involved in activism in that. So I was both in support and also deeply skeptical of some of those what seemed to me like performative expressions of allyship. So with all of these with all of these things in mind, I want to say that one of the things that's really driven a lot of my thinking around this project and helped as a lesson to keep in mind has been the premise that Harney and Moten elaborate in the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. And what they assert is that study is not delimited by any field or by the university. And so that then academic disciplines or fields like Japanese studies in particular, with all of its rigid protocols of apprenticeship, in contrast to that, study becomes, quote, a mode of thinking with others separate from the thinking that the institution requires of you. And that's from page 11 of the Undercommons. And this entails not blindly accruing expertise in a singular way, but rather crafting modes of thinking and making in common with co-conspirators within and without the academy. And I think that this second part is really important. What would it mean to, on the one hand, use what has to be used from the university, but also keeping a kind of critical distance from the university and what it demands of us to repurpose, to repair, and to imagine otherwise, in Candace Chu's words. So what we're trying to do then with JSAP was to establish trans-institutional mentoring networks of middle to high school students, undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, and non-academic partners. Part of that work has to be archival. It has to look to the past and not just the immediate past of the 20th century or the 19th century and thinking about chattel slavery and so forth, but the deep pre-modern past, which is the medieval times, and thinking about how things like race are developed. We'll talk more about that in terms of the class. And I think that one of the goals then is that anti-racist pedagogy could transform some of the field's habits of inquiry by insisting upon a less hostile stance towards issues of racial discrimination in both texts and in one's institutional environments. I think that one of the goals would then be to authorize BIPOC scholars to offer their insights without apology or without the charge of merely doing me-search. Anti-racist research that traced stubborn inequalities in departmental demographics, hiring decisions, retention rates, time to degree, would all illuminate how scholars are made and who tends to thrive versus barely survive. And I think that maybe to close for now, what I'd like to suggest is that the goal of this project in the broadest sense is really to encourage a kind of thriving, encourage study that is not delimited finally by the university, and to think more about ways in which how we read, how we think together might undo some of the violence that we've been kind of steeped in. So with that in mind, the question I'd ask is, how should we respond to the current circumstances when we understand those current circumstances as always being shot through with historical traumas, with the residue and the vestiges of the past, whether that relates to the racism of World War II, or whether that relates to what Caretha Mitchell refers to as a certain type of white mediocrity that is killing us, not just with 45 and the recent president, but these decisions that on micro scales, but also macro scales, actually induce us closer towards something called premature death, which Ruthie Gilmore talks a lot about in terms of thinking about racism. So this is a kind of overview of some kind of larger concepts. Sophie and Rachel will then talk more about the nitty-gritty of their own interests and these kind of aspects of the class that we taught this past semester and how that relates. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sophie. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So let me just share my screen so we can get started. All right, so I said it earlier before, but my name is Sophie Hasuo. I am a master's student here at the University of Michigan in the International and Regional Studies program, specializing in Japanese studies. So here's just a little bit about my academic background. So my undergraduate major was in liberal arts. I concentrated specifically on international studies, although that sounds quite broad. And it was during this time that I began researching identity formation of Zainichi Koreans in Japan through ethnic education classes. So my research interests have evolved considerably over the 2 years I've been here at U of M, shifting to legacies of World War II Japanese American incarceration, the construction of the model minority myth, and the reemergence of yellow peril rhetoric, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. I've grappled with navigating my research through the often limiting boundaries of area studies as I focused on diasporic sites which sit at the intersection of local and global. Working on the JSAP project and helping develop the Asian 480 class was a really unique opportunity to use my perspective as a student to construct a syllabus for a class to help students explore the connections between regions from different fields of study. So in this syllabus, I took the lead on curating the sessions about Japanese American incarceration and the post-World War II creation and maintenance of the model minority myth. I selected readings that complicate and challenge the idea of the model minority, as many in the Asian American community aim to recognize our own complicity and participation in structural racism and anti-Black rhetoric, and try to take steps to unlearn such modes of thinking that support white supremacy. In particular, I included works that showcase acts of resistance and resilience within the camps, including Lawson Inada's poems from Legends from Camp, Brian Hayashi's historicization of the Japanese American community pre-World War II in Democratizing the Enemy, the Japanese American Internment, and selections from Arthur Hansen's book, Barred Voices, Oral History, Resistance, and the World War II Japanese American Social Disaster. In addition, I also added texts that look at the struggles of minority groups in the context of Japan, mainly that of Ainu and Barakumin, and complemented by theoretical texts by Benedict Anderson, Omian Winant, and Anthony D. Smith that help to understand the malleable nature of concepts like race and ethnicity. The amazing Toyota visiting professor, Professor Huaji Shin, taught a class last fall titled Race, Ethnicity, and Nationhood. And that experience largely informed my interest in including these texts that consider the process of racial formation from a sociological perspective, which I think is really helpful for students. Speaking of, I also took this class as a student, and despite helping create the syllabus, the class itself still challenged me considerably, particularly through the oral midterm, which forced me to have to identify connections between concepts and readings quickly and articulate myself succinctly. Also, I found myself struggling to digest foundational texts by Sylvia Wynter, Geraldine Hung, and Orlando Patterson. However, reading about how these ideas were formulated between Europe, the US, and Japan since the medieval period helped my own understanding of the complexities of race, identity, and nationality in Japan. The weekly graduate student sessions also gave me more time and space to generate productive conversations with other folks as we focused on analyzing and closely reading specific texts. One reading that was really helpful in my understanding of class themes was Orlando Patterson's Introduction, The Constituent Elements of Slavery. His concept of social death, while at first quite difficult to understand, ended up being very useful in making connections with other readings, namely Eric Brown's article about racializing Barakumin as a separate caste, and Maria Shimabuku's chapter on the illegality of mixed-race bodies and women in Okinawa, and Thomas Nelson's article on how Korean and Chinese slaves in Japan found themselves profoundly alienated from their home communities. So I listed some questions that came from my readings and reading responses. So these included, when is reparative justice achieved and how can it be made sustainable? How is the act of defining who is included in reparations in itself a form of violence? How is the dehumanization of a class group, such as Barakumin, reflected in Patterson's concept of social death? How can we think of the model minority trope as an extension of polite racism? What connections can be identified between minority groups through a lens of public health? For example, by looking at the displacement of Baraku people to environmentally unsafe areas, the redlining of Black communities in Flint, Michigan, and accelerated environmental degradation of Ainu lands, and equations of Asian bodies with disease. Not all of these questions were answered by the end of the semester, but they were really useful to think through with other students in breakout rooms and whole group discussions. And lastly, I just wanted to talk a bit about my final project. So for my final project, I collaborated with two really amazing, brilliant undergraduate students, Reka and Janice, on a podcast recording. So the main aims of this podcast were to problematize the generalized term Asian American and to collaboratively discuss methods of practicing anti-racism within our local communities. We also wanted to discuss the ways in which anti-racist practices can be improved in educational spaces. So we explored questions like, how did you perceive race growing up? How did your elders and teachers influence the formation of these ideas? How do you identify and how has that changed over the years in the context of college? And how do you define anti-racism and practice it not only in academic spaces, but also your day-to-day activities? So recording a podcast for a final assignment was very new to me. I'm used to writing large research papers. And while podcasts can be easier and less time consuming than, say, writing a 25-page research paper, they also require other interpersonal skills to be strengthened, like listening, speaking, and summarizing. As we had discussed the construction and deployment of the model minority myth in the middle of the semester, I wanted to reflect more on my own participation in Asian American tropes of being quiet, passive, and apolitical. This was another reason why I felt it all the more important to use my actual voice to talk about my experiences and how I've grown to imagine race and anti-racism in the US, Japan, and beyond. Although centering oneself in their research may be considered a bit taboo in academia, I believe I was able to explore my lived experiences as a mixed race Japanese American woman in a really productive way alongside Reka and Janice. As we engaged in discussion using key texts that informed our racial formation and the differences in growing up Asian American in the context of Los Angeles, New York, and Michigan, we were able to collaboratively and critically reflect on our own positionality as we imagined a more inclusive educational environment dedicated to anti-racist praxis with the continued work of educators and students. So just to conclude my brief reflections, although I helped prepare some of the materials for this class, I also learned a great deal this semester as a student, particularly about medieval European Japanese connections and the ways religion served as an important vehicle for racial formation. I gained knowledge of the history of how anti-Blackness became more entrenched in Japan through US minstrel shows, Dutch-Japanese relations, and the growing aspiration towards whiteness. Working with Rachel on the Feminist reading group these past 7 months, I've been able to expand my thinking about solidarity, mobility, and agency with scholars across the country and around the world who also research beyond the boundaries of Japanese studies or area studies. I've been really inspired, energized, and encouraged by these interactions, as well as by this webinar series and podcast with our other JSAP collaborators. So this ends my portion of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back for the Q&A section. But for now, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Sophie, and hello again, everyone. My name is Rachel Willis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, and I'll be starting a PhD in English at the University of Chicago this fall. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself and my research and kind of how I came to join this team. At Michigan, I completed my Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and French and Francophone Studies. I then went on to complete a Master of Arts in Transcultural Studies. My research interests include Afro-diasporic literature, especially in the context of the Caribbean, women's literature, queer theory, and Black feminist pedagogy. I'm particularly interested in examining intimacy, eroticism, and kinship between women in fiction, and looking at the relationship between constructs of race and constructs of sexuality from the early modern period into the 20th century. So Professor Jackson asked me to be part of this team because from the very beginning, JSAP was conceptualized as a project that would be undergirded by critical race theory and Black feminist theory. And my background as a student who spent much of my undergrad and master's studying both of these things meant that I could contribute to the project's theoretical and ideological objectives, even if I didn't have a background in Japanese studies. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my contributions to the course syllabus, which included primary sources that I found in the archive, as well as some core critical race theory texts. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. 1 second. Okay. And present. Okay. So as Sophie mentioned earlier, there were a few key critical race theory texts that we had students read in order to kind of ground their understanding of the history of race and the social process of racialization. The very first text they read, however, was Kimberly Crenshaw's Introduction to Seeing Race Again, Countering Color Blindness Across the Disciplines. I actually suggested this text because my younger sister, who's a college freshman at Michigan at the time, was taking like a first year writing seminar, and this was one of her assigned readings. And so she had asked me to help her kind of figure out how to structure a college level response paper. And so we ended up discussing it at length after we both read it. And I thought the introduction was a good jumping off point for a student who is new to critical race theory and who may not have a firm understanding of, for example, what institutional racism means. And I thought it was important to have students in the course read this text because it's pretty accessible, and because I thought it was important for them to understand why a course called Antiracism and Japanese Studies would even be necessary to offer at the University of Michigan. So after we had students read Crenshaw's introduction, we actually posed them 2 questions. And this was the first or second time the class met, I think. So those 2 questions were, what is race and what does race do? And I want to share their responses here. So the first student said, race is a socially constructed categorization of people based on arbitrary physical features or geographic location meant to divide and categorize people. Another student said, race is a socially constructed idea that is constructed by institutions such as education, the media, and the government. The third student said, race manifests in concrete terms and actions because people view it as a fixed and unchangeable fact, which creates spheres of belonging and unbelonging. Another student said, race generalizes people under an umbrella without taking account for individual differences. And finally, a student said, race is derived from the context of the global slave economy. So as you can see, many of the students had what I would consider a fairly sophisticated view of race and its function from the start. Of course, there was variation, as we also had students who thought that all biracial people had to be half Black, or who didn't quite understand what the difference between race and ethnicity and nationality was. But I think these responses from the first day indicated a generally firm grasp on several things. First, that race is socially constructed, that institutions such as the media and the educational system continue to construct race, so it's an ongoing process. Thirdly, that even if race is socially constructed, it still produces concrete results in people's lives. Fourth, that race creates in-groups and out-groups. And then finally, that race has something to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Seems to be the general agreement among students. I think the level of sophistication in their responses reflects the growing accessibility and hypervisibility of racial theory on social media, as more and more people are becoming fluent in these kinds of terms like critical race theory and intersectionality, for better or for worse, whereas these terms were seldom mentioned in mainstream discourse 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. But I think the responses are also indicative of somewhat of a US-centric or Western-centric view of race and race history. So one of the goals of this course was to help students understand critical race theory, but also be able to parse out its limitations in the context of Japan. As our previous webinar presenters have pointed out, these theories that are largely coming out of the US Academy in the field of Black studies can really only take you so far when you're looking at, say, the way that Zainichi Koreans have been treated by the Japanese government, even though they are technically the same race, or as I'll discuss later in this presentation, the somewhat privileged status held by Black women military professionals in post-war Japan. So the goal here was to help students figure out what translates and what doesn't, what's useful and what's insufficient, what we can take from these already well-established theories of race and how we can add to them or nuance them in a way that more accurately reflects the reality of race and race history in Japan. And so the first key race theory text that we introduced in the course, which Sophie talked about a little bit earlier from her perspective as a student, was Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death. So we actually introduced this text early in the course during the weeks we spent discussing the pre-modern period and medieval slavery in Japan. So you might ask yourself, what would be the use of introducing a book that is primarily about the transatlantic slave trade in this context? But we found that because students were more familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, this text provided, I guess you could say, an accessible entry point for them to bridge that gap between, on one hand, their preconceived notions about what slavery is, which tends to be pretty US centric, and their preconceived notions about Japan, in which slavery as a historical reality doesn't necessarily come immediately to mind for most students. So as I said before, it seems to be generative for students to see what doesn't translate, such as Patterson's concept of natal alienation, for example, because in the Japanese context, a slave could inherit a family name, whereas this was not the case in the US or in ancient Greece and Rome, for example. So we also spent time thinking about what social death looked like, specifically in the context of Japanese slavery, and how that may have set the stage for how Japan would come to understand race in the centuries after. So the second core text we used was Sylvia Wynter's 1492, A New World View, which moves us from the pre-modern into the early modern period in order to provide an introduction to the history of race. Students seem especially interested in parsing apart the term sociogeny that Wynter uses towards the end of the piece to describe, to put it simply, the process by which a subject's identity and consciousness is shaped by external social forces. And this is opposed to the ontogenic viewpoint where a subject is shaped purely by internal biological forces. So it's almost but not quite the nature versus nurture argument, but that's putting it in very simplistic terms, I would say. We found that this discussion was helpful for prompting students to continue thinking through what exactly race is and what it does in different contexts and time periods. But I think that they were having trouble wrapping their minds around Wynter's concept of sociogeny because they were more used to thinking of race as a process where certain characteristics are assigned to an individual, but not necessarily as a process that can actually shape the psyche of the individual themselves, which is what Wynter's kind of getting at here. And there's also a glaring inattention to Asia in Wynter's text, which focuses pretty much entirely on Europe, Africa, and the Americas as sites of early modern racial formation. And so that was a topic of lengthy discussion as well. The third core text that we discussed, Michael Omi and Howard Renant's Racial Formation in the United States, I think helps students get more at what sociogeny means precisely, because it really breaks down what racialization is as a social process, and it is a much shorter and less dense text as well. And this actually turned out to be a favorite piece for students to do their projects and their response papers on. However, as the title suggests, it is discussing racial formation in the United States. And so once again, we had to have a discussion of the limitations of this theory and how it might look different in the context of Japan. So apart from selecting these secondary theoretical texts, a large portion of my early work on the JSAP project was digging through the archives and seeing what could be found initially in relation to potential records of African-American soldiers who might have been trained at the Japanese language schools during World War II and the post-war period. What I ended up finding instead were a lot of primary sources about African-American women in Japan during the post-war period. So most of these sources were African-American newspaper clippings that I found on the ProQuest database. They featured write-ups and interviews by and about African-American women professionals who were employed by the US military in Japan to work as nurses, teachers, administrative officers, etc. These women occupied extremely privileged positions in the post-war Japanese landscape. Many of them described having servants and maids for the first time, purchasing luxury items very cheaply due to the strength of the American dollar, and spending their evenings lounging at hotels and dance halls. They wrote enthusiastically back home to encourage other African Americans to consider moving to Japan, where they could be treated like Americans instead of like Negroes. Often, but not always, failing to mention the subjugated status of the Japanese people who were servicing them. And if you're interested in reading more about this, I would recommend Yasuhiro Okada's Negotiating Race and Womanhood Across the Pacific, African-American Women in Japan Under US Military Occupation. And so I think it was important to have students read these. I suggested that we include it in the syllabus because I think it gave them a lot of nuance to think through, as these were African-American women in a space where they simultaneously possessed a great deal of social and financial capital as employees of the US military, who often live quite extravagant lifestyles, but who also were still enduring a lot of racism from white officers and who were only being given a temporary elevation in social status that would vanish once they were discharged home. I could sense that there was a lot of discomfort among some of the students when it came to reading this. And I think that they were not sure how to think about it since they were used to the US context, where you have, on one hand, the model minority construct, and then you have Black women at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And so I think to see it rearranged in this way was something that required them to think a little bit differently about intersectionality and about how power functions and fluctuates in a given space. And so as a note to kind of end on, speaking as someone who was involved in the design of this course, but who was also an undergraduate student not too long ago, I think these moments of discomfort and limitation in the classroom can be very generative and very impactful. I think they push students to think beyond the sort of very starkly Black and white and unnuanced forms of thinking and discourse that we see often in social media and in journalism and politics. I think this ultimately lends itself to the project of anti-racist education because it equips students who are the future leaders of these institutions with the ability to think critically and multivalently about complex social mechanisms like racism, hierarchy, power, and identity politics, and why these things are malleable and why they work differently in different contexts. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation, and I think I'll hand things back to Professor Jackson. I believe we're going to have a little bit of discussion among the three of us, and then we'll start taking questions. Sharing. All right. Glad to have you guys back. Oh, Professor Jackson, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was clapping. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much, Sophie, for all of your wonderful thoughts and reflections on the class and your own experience and so forth. So at this point, before we kind of dive headlong into the Q&A, we'd like to kind of think a little bit about some of the things that we said and maybe talk a little bit more in detail about not just the class, but then also some of the other JSAP initiatives and things that might be drawn from lessons in particular that might be drawn from those experiences. So I thought I might just ask you guys as the coordinators of this more about the feminist reading group and in particular, if you could talk about that, the goals of that, but then also maybe at a more granular level, what types of techniques or you were using to not just select text, but then also produce the kind of setting for intellectual exchange that you thought would be most useful.
Yeah, Sophie, I guess I can talk about it first. So we had like I think Sophie mentioned it briefly in her presentation, but didn't go into detail. I think we started in December 2020, and then our last meeting is this coming Monday. Just a feminist reading group for scholars in Japanese studies, but also adjacent fields. We've met monthly, and I can talk, I guess, about like kind of the techniques that we really wanted to employ in this context. I think for me and also for Sophie, we wanted to create an environment that would feel like a community, I guess, where you can kind of just be a person. So we like often in our meetings, we often checked in to talk about people's lives and how they were doing, how's your book going, that kind of thing, but also what TV shows are you watching, and what video games are you into, that kind of stuff, to just kind of like break out of that very like cold and clinical academic environment that you get used to. Um, and I know I felt that it was important to cultivate this kind of environment of care and community, especially because most of the participants in the group were women of color. And so we wanted it to feel kind of like a refuge and a space where we can all just kind of breathe. And like I said, just be a person. And Sophie, if you want to talk a little bit more about it.
Sure, yeah. So I think I speak for Rachel and myself when I say that we wanted to construct a space where we could delve into readings that you wouldn't typically find, I'd say, in area studies. So for example, reading Du Bois's Dark Princess and relating that to thinking through Afro-Asian solidarities, looking at manga episodes, looking at Grace Ting's article on horrific femininities. And these discussions were so generative, I think partly because the folks who are in the reading group aren't necessarily all in Japanese studies. We have people in American studies, Francophone studies like Rachel. And I think this space was really productive in that we were able to use different lenses to look at one or two readings. So we didn't, because everyone's so busy, we didn't inundate people with books and books and books. We really just spent like 2 hours talking about one 15-page article. And I think it's so impressive also that we were able to do that and parse out things that are super useful. And some of the professors who are in the reading group were able to incorporate those themes and the discussion questions that Rachel and I constructed in their own classes, which is really nice to see as a student. And I think also just trying to look at maybe narratives that aren't super mainstream. So thinking through an article or a piece of work through like focusing only on gender or focusing more from like an African-American lens, I think was super generative, like I said. And I'm really happy with honestly how the 7 months have been. I think it's been really amazing. We've been able to incorporate readings from our fellow JSAP collaborators. So Andrea Mendoza and Huaji Shin. And I think it's been really great.
Thank you for talking about that a bit. I mean, I was maybe one of the things that you brought up, Sophie, was just what it means to incorporate or interests of students as well. And I think it relates to a broader maybe theme of some of the things we've been trying to do around this notion of unlearning, or at least of, you mentioned in terms of area studies, but one way to think about that is in terms of the certain styles of expertise that are privileged or really kind of advocated for in those spaces, and trying to move away from that a little bit, and that can actually open up. So if you have folks that are working on Asian American studies and also media studies and also Black Francophone Caribbean feminist work and so forth, that's actually, that adds, it doesn't detract, right? And so I was just thinking, for those of you folks out there who are educators, to maybe really consider thinking about what it means to more vigorously incorporate student-led or student-chosen kind of activities and readings and so forth, so that folks can thrive in that way as well, might be something maybe worth underscoring. Yeah. I was wondering too, maybe if folks had thoughts now. You mentioned, you talked, Rachel, for instance, about the winter in relation to the Crenshaw, and I was struck by and one of the things I wanted to do, people that know me as a pre-modernist, is to not let the pre-modern stuff just fall by the wayside. I think one of the things that in terms of the course planning, it's important to say is that we were trying to, for me at least, I didn't want it to be so presentist. A lot of the discourse about race, about discrimination tends to focus on basically legacies of US kind of chattel slavery, and then, kind of Jim Crow, from the 19th into the 20th century and so forth, and trying to work against that. And so I think that for me, that really, it's still hard for me, the winter text. And I remember, Rachel, when you kind of encountered the 1492 text, people tend to pull their hair out. But could you talk a little bit more about about maybe the usefulness of some of that, or what the kind of pre-modern stuff, you know, adds, and alongside some of the things that are very contemporary?
Oh, okay. I guess I'm answering this one because Sophie just unmuted me. So you're asking like how the pre-modern stuff adds to like our understandings of like present conditions of race and racialization? That kind of
Yeah,
what
to a
you're
certain extent.
saying?
Yeah, yeah. So we taught the Crenshaw and the Winter relative. I mean, we didn't teach them in the same thing, but we taught the Geraldine Hung, right, on the medieval invention of race, and then the Crenshaw in the same week, if I remember correctly. That was right off the bat. And so part of the juxtaposition there, like what that adds or what that might kind of do to disorient or to kind of reorient folks in different ways. Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective at least, because I was new to the Winter too. I guess it's easy to think of these things as like think of it in like a kind of a presentist mindset, if that makes sense, and think of these things as um, being unique to like our time and seeing kind of the like the continuation and the evolution of how race has been um, like utilized as like a weapon against different groups going back to the pre-modern era with like the racialization of Jews and Muslims in Europe, for example, was at least eye-opening to me. I had some sense of it because, like I said, I've taken critical race theory courses and taken Black studies courses, and so I knew like um, I knew about the Code Noir and the Francophone context and some of these like older texts from like the 1600s and 1700s, but I wasn't aware of exactly how far back it actually went. So Sophie, I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, I also really delve in modern stuff. So I think reading about medieval and early modern period constructions of race was really hard at first. I had a lot of headaches in the beginning of the semester and even during class. But I think as the semester progressed, I was realizing that I was really it was molding a bit more, and I was able to relate, say, the Jesuits in Japan and that everything that happened with that to like present day, how we look at maps and how we look at race and different hierarchies of belonging. And that was really useful for me. Keisuke Yamada's article as well, like historicizing Japan and its relationship with Blackness and anti-Blackness was also super helpful as we learned about Dutch-Japanese relations and how racial formation was constructed there. I think it's really important, especially now. I think that we historicize where a lot of these tensions come from. Yes, they're imagined, but they're not, they didn't come out of the blue yesterday. And I think a lot of times people try and find band-aids to fix racism. And I think it's really important that we look at how we recognize how long these histories are. So that was super helpful for me. And it made me have a new appreciation, I think, as well, for medieval literature. Even just looking at Sayami's plays and how the slave was represented there. All of these things are really interesting to look at as sites of racial formation, even if there wasn't a name yet. But I think it's really important that we continue to look at medieval and early modern period works.
Yay. Thank you. I mean, I think that's one of the things I was just thinking about, is maybe we can turn more towards some of the audience questions too. But one of the things I've been reflecting on is, on the one hand, all of the amazing personal stories and different types of skills that students come into a class like that with, to say nothing of, so you have folks like, Reka and Janice, who are, really smart and, working at these things. that you can talk to them about, for instance, in the final project, Sophie. But then there's also a way in which a pretty kind of myopic, understandably so in the US context, especially, notion of race actually kind of gets in the way of thinking more broadly or imagining different alternatives or kind of possibilities. And so one thing maybe to keep in mind for, again, those of you who are learning and teaching about this is the value that some of that longer historical investigation might lend, just so that we don't take those things for granted, since that can kind of deaden our imagination. So maybe one thing to say before transitioning is just that I think that one of the things that JSAP at least was trying to do was to think about not just kind of teaching, but thinking about, again, this notion of study that I mentioned from the Undercommons, and study as being related to education, but with very different priorities, and about this kind of building of community that Rachel was talking a bit about, some kind of care that's not about funding and key performance indicators and enrollments and all these other things that the university tends to do. And this, for me, has a lot to do with what Bill Reddings talks about in terms of focusing on accountability, not just accounting, and that shift that's happened. So I wonder along those lines, if what types of structures might lend themselves to that, and how it's important in some ways to have spaces, like multiple types of spaces. And here I think about like the Paperson and the multi-scalar notion, right? So you have these really small things with all these really large things that are near and far away. So having something like a class, but then also having something like a reading group. And also, I think you guys didn't mention it, but it's important to think too about the types of collaborators, which is to say there's folks who are contingent faculty, and there's folks who are full professors, and there's folks who are junior, there's folks who are interested in that as undergraduates, but also as graduate students, right? And trying to think about that as well in terms of representation, again, in terms of who's invited and who's not, I think is important. Yeah.
I was wondering, Professor Jackson, if you wanted to speak a little bit about in the class, the interview project that we had to do, where we interviewed, I think, someone within class or outside of class about their own conceptions of race, and or the final project, which I believe you mentioned that it was mostly podcasts or non-traditional projects. And I wonder like how those forms of collaboration, how those translated to you, and how you saw that, I think, that collaboration within students and what you thought of it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. No, I thought it was great. I mean, one of the hopes, and this is hard. I mean, I should say that this class was successful in lots of ways, and less successful in other ways, and a lot of that, kind of falls on me less than you guys, who were consistently awesome. I think, but yeah, I mean, one of the things I really wanted to get away from was, again, partially this notion of expertise that tends to focus on those 25-page research papers that you were talking about, Sophie, which are great and useful in terms of like bibliographically and teaching people how to write, how to make an argument, how to cite primary and secondary sources. Like, all of those things are useful. But then the question for me is always like, toward what end? And if you're not going to be an academic, and if maybe your sense of how to transform your surroundings or the world more broadly is not just based in text, right? What options are available, and I think one of the things that was really important to me was to try to think about rigor and value in, interpersonal interaction. So the interview project was partially recognizing that what you said about these other skills, right? Some folks, for whatever reason, I mean, so for instance, if you have folks who are native speakers of English or aren't, right? Or there's lots of folks that, for instance, might not feel as entirely comfortable in English, but have lots of really amazing things to say. If only one, if they feel entitled to, or have to give themselves permission to say these things, and to be able to kind of develop that as a skill, I think was something else that seemed important. And that's also part of the logic behind the midterm, the oral midterm. It's like, okay, so it's one thing to read these things, but it's very difficult to be able to, in a concise manner, to be both accurate, precise, and concise, to boil some of these things down and engage someone in a conversation. And I think that one of the things that I would say, I didn't go into all of the things that were that seemed wrong to me about the world when I was thinking about the class. But one of the things that I noticed was that there are lots of pundits, many of them talking heads and other folks that I saw that had a lot of airtime, who I mark as supremacists, who felt all too entitled to speak all the time and felt all too comfortable in the language of hate and of division and so on and so forth. And I kept thinking, it's not to say that there aren't all kinds of activists on the other sides that are capable of doing that, but I just thought, there's students in this class and students that I've taught in other classes before this who have these ideas and are so smart and so good, but are just terrified of speaking for whatever reason, because they have this kind of perfectionism, or because they don't feel in some ways like their ideas matter. And so the idea of this was to kind of basically invite / like nudge folks into that direction so that they could kind of take ownership over their own voices to a different degree, and to not grade in terms of, that should have been a semicolon, not a comma kind of thing, but did you listen well, right? Did you engage this person, well, and to kind of really affirm that as a way of being in the world. And that's partially about a disciplinary set of tendencies that I don't like within, say, Japanese studies more broadly, but then also in terms of just having more voices of really smart people that are really thoughtful. Like, that takes practice too, right? So this notion of hope being a discipline, I think, is like the discipline of learning how to speak your mind, and understand that what one has to say is really valuable, even though most of the folks that you hear saying things don't necessarily look or sound like you. That's really important. So anyway, so with that, should we turn to the Q&A maybe? Let's look at some of the questions. So thank you. It looks like there's a bunch of questions from folks. I think that why don't we start with this one? There's a question from Lita Ray. Do you guys see this one? I'll read it out in case you don't see it. But Lita writes, hello. Some famous Japanese persons, athletes of color, maybe Naomi Osaka, and a few individuals I have met spoke about not feeling accepted by Japanese society. Many sociology or anti-racism college classes here start by talking about privilege and different social identities, sexuality, ability, gender. Are there classes like this in the Japanese academic environment, and do they discuss privilege and social identities?
I'm not really sure what she means by are there I'm sure classes exist everywhere. I guess specifically that I've been in many classes actually in Michigan that do make it a point to talk about positionality. And I think some are related to Japanese studies. I think what I've learned actually from this last semester is the importance of looking at different areas. So looking at sociology, looking at gender studies, not only in their research and their pedagogy, but also in the way that some of these other classes are structured, and using that. So the Asian 480 class, for example, was a really interdisciplinary class. And I think we did make it a point to talk about social identities, different minority groups, as I think everyone here presented on. In particular, this past semester, I took a class called Transnational Feminisms, and that was super useful. It didn't focus on Japan, but it was super useful in thinking about different hierarchies and privilege and how they are deployed. And I think that can definitely be used in other classes. So Professor Hwaji Shin's class last semester, it was a Japanese class, Japanese studies class, but also in a way like a sociology class. And we talked about folks like Naomi Osaka and mixed race folks, and how they have to navigate different spaces of belonging and what that means, and how race and ethnicity play a central part in that. Yeah, so that would be my answer. Professor Jackson, do you have anything to add?
I think that's a great start. I wasn't sure if Lita's question was about kind of Japanese environment in terms of like Japanese studies, or actually in Japan. And so, yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
I was going to say, I believe she added a clarification.
Oh, did she? I'm sorry. In Japan. Great. In Japan, yeah.
Okay,
yeah. So
I think you've been abroad. You studied abroad in Japan, yeah?
Yes, but not
I don't know.
necessarily
So
taking
I can't
college
answer
Taking those
that.
classes,
classes
so
on
I'm not
those
going to
things.
comment
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that.
Right. You put her on the spot. Yeah, no, I think, well, I think the person to ask in this case would probably be more Professor Huaji Shin, who has a comment too. But the quick answer, first of all, I'd say, Lita or any of the folks who are here today, feel free to follow up with us about things. This is only the beginning of a longer conversation, obviously. No, there's these kinds of classes. I mean, I'm a big fan of, there's lots of folks who are doing things like this, but there's Amiken, or the American Studies kind of group in the context of Japan that does this kind of work. There's lots of scholars, folks like our own JSAP contributor, Professor Anne-Maria Shimabuku, who works on a lot of these issues between kind of United States Academy or North American Academy and in Japan, particularly as it relates to Okinawa, for instance, who's very attuned to these kinds of things. So things like Indigenous studies groups in Japan, particularly Okinawan studies and research groups in Japan, there's these kinds of things. And also in the context of Black studies in Japan. So one of my favorite people on the planet is a scholar named Professor Azusa Nishimoto, who's a scholar of Toni Morrison at Aoyama Gakuin. And she routinely, in a really great way, talks about not just kind of Black culture and Black literary production, but also its relation to, for instance, folks like Lawson Inada and his kind of blues and jazz poetry in the context of Japanese incarceration, right? So there are these places. I think generally speaking, they tend to be more marginal though, I think, which is part of what you're implying, I think, Lita. And I think that there's all kinds of reasons for that. I think it's partially, I would say, the quick answer is that the Japanese academic version of excellence, which in some ways is even far more corporate and draconian, maybe not more corporate, but certainly more draconian in some ways, particularly at national universities, tends to, I think, devalue some of these questions, partially because of a different notion of cultural essentialism, frankly, that's still operative, where what transnational means or what cross-cultural means tends to be actually really quite narrow. So, but thank you so much for that question. There's a question maybe from, should we go to the one from, that's Mark Levin? I'll read that one. Mark Levin, and Mark, I know I owe you an email, so please forgive me. We've I'm drowning and stuff, but he says, thank you for the incredible work that this project represents. He says, my question goes to there being some misfits between critical race theory and looking at Japan, which Rachel aptly addressed. While CRT grew from seeds and in the soil of the US, it has always seemed to me that the analytical tools that critical race theory scholars developed does allow for progressive insights regarding Japan. But then I, for one, worry about the outsider's appropriate and inappropriate roles in raising such questions. Have you any thoughts as to best practices for promoting positive change within Japan that will recognize, support, and not interfere with the agency of Japanese broadly defined persons in Japan? And then separately, any thoughts as to positive dynamics that might be found in Japan, which might help us look more wisely at circumstances here in the US? Thank you so much for that question, Mark.
So I could take the first part of the question.
Sure. Please go ahead.
About kind of what I was describing, kind of the misfit between critical race theory and looking at Japan. And I just want to be clear, I definitely agree that the CRT does allow for progressive insights in Japan and all over the world, I think. I love critical race theory, I love Black studies theory. That's not to knock it at all. But I guess what I was saying, I'm coming from a context of Francophone studies and the Francophone Caribbean specifically. And so in my own research and writing, I do incorporate a lot of critical race theory from the US in that context. And yet I do sometimes run up against limitations, even just coming down to language, because there are just words that don't translate and words that don't exist in French or in Creole or whatever language you're working with that exist in English. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say there are limitations. I feel like, and I think Professor Shin talked about this in her webinar too, sometimes you just kind of hit a wall there where you just can't, it just doesn't exactly line up. But all of that being said, I still think that there's a lot of value in putting Japanese studies and Black studies into conversation with each other. And I know Professor Shin talked about the Omi and Monat piece, even in her presentation, and how influential Black studies has been in her thinking. But at least in my experience, and I think in the experiences of other scholars who are not based in Black studies, but who still look at race, sometimes there are these moments of disconnect. Yeah, that's what I would say. And then Professor Jackson, I don't know if you want to talk more about the second part of the question.
I'm happy to. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, I mean, I think that I appreciate the concern, Mark, which is a concern we have too about this question of food appropriation or cultural imperialism or what have you. So what does it mean for, let's say, we as Americans to impose in some ways our notions of race or racialization on a Japanese context where some of those things might not work. So there's that. But then also you say in terms of positive dynamics that might be found in Japan, which might help us look more wisely at circumstances here in the US. And I do think that there are things that are useful. I mean, I think that, I think the Burakumin case is really important, right? So thinking about a way in which a certain type of racialization is happening, even, which it's not the same as something like colorism in the United States, but I think that these kinds of discussions about indigeneity, for instance, as it relates to, say, Ainu in Japan, and what it means to, the ways in which I was thinking just more broadly, just because of thinking about foster care and the kind of Indian boarding schools and so forth. But one of the articles we read, talked a lot about the ways in which this Ainu were dispossessed and kind of forced into being farmers, kind of eradicating these natural lifeways and so forth, in part due to a certain broader notion, from the US and Europe and so forth about what it meant to develop into a civilization. And so I think that some of those kinds of things, to think about like these failed experiments that are kind of wrong-headed over history and kind of do a comparative study of those would be really useful. I also think that there is work being done, particularly I think about Anne-Marie Shimabuku's work, but also Mitsuyo Haraka's work about that kind of reciprocal complicity in Okinawa in particular between the Japanese government and the American government in terms of thinking about the marginalization of particularly kind of Black and Japanese bodies in that context. Could be really interesting for thinking about questions of immigration and immigration status and so forth here as well. But those are just kind of off the cuff ideas. Yeah. So I think we have time for maybe one more. Some of these are comments. So Kevin Carr asked like 17 questions. So thank you, Kevin, for your questions. But one is about the explanation and rubric for the midterm, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about. And another is maybe, I think, particularly useful. Maybe we'll do this one quickly. Maybe I'll knock this one out and then we can end with Hwaji's question, if that works for folks. So Kevin says, I'm interested in hearing you talk more about the communities, reading groups, informal meetings, etc., in which you might discuss the issues you have grappled over this year, last year or more. It sounds like it was mostly a positive to have so many BIPOC students and faculty. Is it better, I think, to have fewer scholars like me, white male, etc., or did you wish the participants were more varied? In addition, did you perceive these meetings as labor or as value added for your scholarship and lives? So I'll say something quickly about the first one, and then maybe Sophie or Rachel, if you'd like to add in. Yeah, so there were white folks too. I think, that are involved in different ways and in different kind of parts of the process. I think one thing to think about is like where that collaboration makes the most sense and making use of folks. So I want to think again. I think particularly one of the people who was really incredibly useful, actually, particularly for the Just Futures initiative planning, was Jake Clennell. Jake Crawford, who was amazing staff person that works through those things, and talking with him about kind of the logistics of budgeting, talking about, so there's a difference between the folks who are involved in talking about, say, Grace Ting's amazing kind of article, and the folks that are helpful for like getting the work done so that these folks can get paid and that students, can get kind of recognized for that intellectual labor in different ways. So I think that that's one thing to think about is what it means to kind of collaborate or contribute in different ways. But Sophie, did you want to say more. And there's, I mean, the other thing I'd say is maybe that there's a ton of variation even within those. It's not primarily, so in terms of orientation, in terms of employment status, et cetera. There's another way to think about that, not just in terms of race or sex. Yeah. So.
Yeah, sure. So reading this question, I'm realizing that we had a lot of different communities as in this project. So we had the class, the reading group, the grad sessions. So I think I'm trying to figure all of those out. But yeah, there were definitely white folks there. I think it's really generative to have, you know, different people. And I think it's a bit more realistic to be talking through race and ethnicity and identity, whether it's in the context of Japan or the US, um, with these folks. And I think it's really important. In regards to the second part of the question about perceiving these meetings as labor or as value, I think on one hand it was labor because we were formulating the readings and discussion questions and things like that, but it was energizing labor. And it was labor that I was happy to do because I knew, and it turned out to be that we had really amazing conversations from it, whether it was really difficult conversations where we really have to confront our own biases, or it was just added value in terms of knowledge production and understanding. For me, for example, like the medieval roots of racial formation in Europe. Yeah, so I think overall these meetings are really productive and generative in terms of our own research and scholarship, but also just in thinking through race and also just building community, core communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a whole lot to add, but I'll just echo what Sophie said. And I think there's room to have both. There's room to have all of these things. We thought it was important that reading group was a group predominantly made up of women of color. But we had other spaces like the class, like this webinar, and other things we've been doing that weren't predominantly women of color. And I think both of those spaces were important and had served different roles and had different sorts of value for the project. So yeah, I guess that's all I'll say. And I mean, personally, I spent this whole the past year working a full-time job in addition to this. And I will say that after like my 8-hour day at my other job, like coming to the reading group it didn't feel like labor at all. It felt like I said, it felt like being able to breathe. I think Professor Jackson mentioned earlier, kind of like the suffocating nature of the academy. It just really felt like a breath of fresh air for me, at least.
I'm glad to hear that, and I think we're at time, but I wanted to maybe just say too, along those lines, I mean, this is part of what's really, I think part of what's embedded in your question, Kevin, which is, I think really useful is that, I mentioned before that there's a lot of ways in which diversity work, usually falls disproportionately on folks of color, female scholars, especially to kind of help the university either seem less racist or ideally be less racist. And a lot of that is uncompensated work, right? So on top of all the things we have to do, and there are plenty of things, that we all have to do, whether we're working, multiple jobs or, have families to take care of, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's also why, to Rachel's point, and Sophie's points just now, it's so important to produce spaces that feel like they are invested in some kind of joy, and not just another kind of add-on to this kind of slog, this existential slog of publishing or perishing and so forth. And so when one's humanity is recognized or affirmed, and it's pleasurable to be in these spaces, and it's, energizing to be in these spaces, then, one doesn't feel like, oh, where's my money necessarily. I mean, that can be great too. And we should certainly make sure to pay folks for intellectual labor. But I think that those assumptions or those strictures, right, don't have to operate in the same way. And I think that's really important in terms of the stance of some of these things. So, so we're out of time, but I want to maybe just say partially, as a way to recognize folks, I noticed that Hwaji, you've asked a question about like where things will go from here. And one thing to say briefly is that that the podcast episodes will be kind of coming out slowly but surely over the course of the summer. So the webinars will keep people busy for a long time, and hopefully people can learn a lot from those, which is great. I put some links in the chat as well for things that people want to follow up on. I'd recommend checking out Coretha Mitchell's page and her work as well. You asked about the white mediocrity article, Kevin, and so I'll just type her name into the chat as well. You can find her work there. It's really useful, I think. Recently also enjoyed Zora's Daughters, a podcast by two Black female graduate students at Columbia University, which is also really great about talking about some of these things like abolition in an accessible way, for instance. But I also want to just notice Grace Ting, an amazing scholar, is asked a question or actually made a comment. And I won't read the entire thing for time, but I just want to say that we see you, Grace. We appreciate you. We've read your work with great relish, and we're so glad that you exist and are doing big things all over the world, particularly in Hong Kong right now. And so she says, thank you for the series in a difficult time. It managed to make me feel seen in a way that other discussions of race didn't. And I'm sure others felt similarly. And so thank you so much for saying that. We really appreciate that. And that's a goal. And if that happens, then if we never get another red cent from any institution, then our job is done. But she also says, I realize that while attending these lectures, the amount of PTSD involved, if part of me feels visceral discomfort with the use of the framework of Japanese studies, even in a series that's so powerful, nuanced, and truly moving. So she says, it means a lot that this series was about, quote, Japanese studies, but not about staying in it within its bounds, the same way that death or rebirth suggests. And I think she's probably referring to this kind of rebirth of Japanese studies panels that were happening earlier, I think last year. So she says that it's failure is fine or more than fine, and leaving is also okay sometimes. And then she reminds us, I think this is really useful as a note to end on, that depending on agency or lack thereof, there are multiple ways to leave Japanese studies while working on Japan in Japanese. Not being defined by discipline means knowing yourself better and having others, the ones who matter, know you better as well. So I think that's really wise and moving. And thank you, Grace, for saying that. I think that's really great for all of us, wherever we're located physically or institutionally, to kind of keep that in mind. So yeah. So with that, I don't have anything else to say. Sophie or Rachel, do you want to have any closing words?
Thank you. This has been really wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming. It's been a really energizing webinar series, and I hope it was for everyone else as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you missed any of it or any of the previous webinars, you can be sure to go to our YouTube channel. Sophie has the link in the chat.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you again, Sophie and Rachel, and Harrison, wherever you are. We appreciate your input too. Hwaji, thank you. And all gratitude to all of the folks who've contributed in ways big and small, to all of the thinking that went into this, to say nothing of the logistical wherewithal that we've needed to kind of carry things forward. So yeah, thank you all so much, and please take care of yourselves.